May 1945. The war in Europe was over, but the air in Germany still smelled of smoke, brick dust, and burned timber. Entire cities lay silent, hollowed out by firebombs and artillery. Streets were littered with shattered glass and the echo of marching boots that no longer existed. Through the ruins of a small town near Nuremberg, a column of American GIs advanced cautiously. Helmets tilted forward, rifles at ease, eyes scanning windows for snipers who were no longer there. The sound of their boots against the cobblestones was steady, deliberate, foreign in a land that had only known the rhythm of war for 12 long years. From a doorway, a group of children watched them. Thin, barefoot, their faces streaked with soot. One boy held his little sister's hand tightly, too afraid to move. The soldiers paused. Then one of them, a young man from Ohio, reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small crinkled wrapper, a Hershey bar. Slowly he knelt and held it out. The children stared. They had been told Americans were monsters. Instead, they saw a smile. A moment later, the boy reached forward. The first taste of chocolate melted into silence, and history began to heal, one piece of candy at a time. In the spring of 1945, Germany was a country on its knees. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12. Cities once proud with culture, Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin, had become skeletons of stone and dust. The fires of total war had consumed everything. Bombers had left streets flattened, bridges collapsed, and railways twisted like paper. Entire neighborhoods were gone. Those who survived the bombardments now faced starvation, disease, and the collapse of everything they had been taught to believe. For the German people, defeat came not only as a military loss, but as an unraveling of faith. For years, Nazi propaganda had filled the air with lies, that the Allies would destroy, enslave, and humiliate Germany. Posters and radio speeches warned that Americans were barbarians, a mixed race of killers and criminals, driven by greed and hatred. Mothers told their children to hide when the enemy came. Civilians dug trenches and cellars, whispering that surrender would mean death. But when the shooting stopped, what entered their towns was not vengeance. It was order, cautious, weary, and strangely human. American GIs arrived with their rifles slung low and their eyes watchful, but not cruel. Their first tasks were not to punish, but to restore, to clear debris, secure roads, and feed the hungry. By May, more than 2 million U.S. soldiers were stationed across occupied Germany. The war in Europe had ended officially on May 8, 1945, but for the soldiers who remained, another mission had begun. One not of conquest, but of reconstruction. The U.S. Army, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced a humanitarian crisis on a scale unseen in modern history. Over 20 million civilians were displaced. Entire families wandered roads in search of food, shelter, or news of missing relatives. To prevent starvation, the Allies launched what they called Operation Victuals, a massive effort to provide emergency food relief. But even before that, individual soldiers were already sharing what little they had. In mess halls, men set aside rations of canned meat, bread, and sugar. In pockets, they kept the smaller treasures, sticks of gum, hard candy, and chocolate bars, tokens of a world that had not yet been destroyed. For German civilians, especially children, the arrival of American rations was almost beyond imagination. Food had been scarce for years. Under Nazi rule, the war economy had drained every resource toward the front. By 1944, bread was mixed with sawdust, meat was reserved for the military, and sugar was a memory. Children grew up never having tasted real sweets. Their only knowledge of candy came from faded advertisements or distant stories from before the war. So when the first American convoys rolled through the ruined cities, and soldiers handed out chocolate or M&Ms, a candy barely a decade old, it was like a miracle. The taste was foreign, overwhelming. It melted too fast, too rich for stomachs used to hunger. For the children, it was not just food. It was proof that the world outside the Reich was not made of monsters. For the soldiers, these gestures came naturally, but also as a kind of relief. After years of combat, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes, they were tired of destruction. They had seen enough death to fill a lifetime. To kneel in front of a child and offer something sweet felt like reclaiming a piece of humanity they feared they'd lost. Photographs from the time capture these moments in grainy black and white. A GI kneeling beside a group of children in a bombed-out street, their faces alight with wonder. Another shows a line of German kids outside a supply truck, their hands outstretched, waiting for candy bars tossed from the back. In some villages, the soldiers even improvised games, teaching the children how to chew gum or trade wrappers. This simple act of generosity carried immense symbolic weight. It was the first step toward trust in a land where every wall had once carried slogans of hate. Propaganda had collapsed, replaced by living proof, the kind that could be seen, touched, and tasted. Eisenhower's orders to his men reflected this delicate balance. The U.S. Army was there to maintain discipline and prevent chaos, but also to model the ideals of democracy and decency. Soldiers were instructed not to fraternize with the enemy at first, yet in practice the rules blurred. Hunger has no ideology, and kindness once offered cannot be withdrawn. In the refugee camps that sprang up across southern and western Germany, the situation was dire. Millions of displaced persons, Poles, Ukrainians, French, Czechs, mingled with defeated German civilians. Disease spread quickly, supplies were short, and still American soldiers continued to share what little comfort they could spare. Hershey bars and M&Ms became informal currency, small, edible fragments of hope. Among the occupying troops, a quiet understanding grew. If Germany was to rise again, it could not be rebuilt on punishment alone. The American policy of re-education began to take shape, not through classrooms at first, but through actions, gestures, and behavior. The soldiers themselves became teachers, demonstrating what freedom looked like by example. In ruined schools, American officers helped restart lessons, bringing pencils, paper, and chalk. They encouraged local mayors to reopen bakeries and markets. Children's programs aired on makeshift radios, teaching English words alongside songs of peace. In that fragile beginning, chocolate and candy served as the first vocabulary of reconciliation. To a child who had grown up under the roar of air raids, the sight of an American soldier offering a sweet carried power greater than any speech. It said, "You will not be punished for what you were born into." It said, "You can start again." Many years later, German adults who had been children then would still recall that first taste. The sweetness, they said, was overwhelming, almost unbearable, not because of the flavor, but because of what it represented: safety. And so, amid the rubble and the hunger, a quiet transformation began. Streets once filled with fear now echoed with the faint sound of laughter. Not much, but enough to remind both the conquerors and the conquered that the war, in spirit, might finally be ending. And from that fragile beginning, gone from a piece of candy, handed to a child, the moral foundation of a new relationship between America and Germany began to form. Would grow stronger in the months ahead, as the soldiers' kindness became the seeds of something far greater than anyone imagined. In the months following Germany's surrender, the nation remained a vast landscape of contradictions. Hunger and humiliation hung in the air, yet there was something else, and a curiosity. Beneath the rubble, amid the ruins of ideology, the German people began to look at the Americans not as conquerors, but as enigmas. The soldiers who patrolled their streets had rifles, yes, but also chewing gum, smiles, and a kind of relaxed confidence that defied everything they had been told. For the Americans, too, this was a strange transition. Just weeks earlier, many of these same men had fought through hedgerows and winter forests against an enemy that refused to surrender. Now that enemy was gone, replaced by civilians, hungry, dazed, and desperate. The shift from combat to compassion was not easy. In barracks and bivouacs across occupied Germany, GIs faced an emotional conflict of their own. The propaganda they had heard for years, and of ruthless Nazis, of fanaticism, of cruelty, had been true in part. The concentration camps they liberated revealed horrors that words could not contain, yet on the streets outside, they saw children no different from the ones they had left at home. Private James Maddox of the 9th Infantry wrote in a letter to his wife, "I never thought I'd feel sorry for a German, but then I saw this little girl in Frankfurt with no shoes, standing in front of a burned-out bakery. I gave her a piece of chocolate from my pack. She smiled. The first real smile I've seen since this war started. I cried like a fool." These acts, small, quiet, almost unrecorded, carried immense symbolic weight. They humanized both sides. The Hershey bar became a bridge between victor and vanquished, soldier and civilian, adult and child. The GI's perspective. For many American soldiers, generosity was not a matter of policy but instinct. They came from a nation that, despite its own struggles, had never experienced war on its own soil. To see such devastation firsthand, families living in bombed cellars, children begging for bread, stirred something deep within them. They were young men barely out of high school, and they suddenly found themselves the face of America in a broken world. Chocolate was more than a treat. It was morale in solid form. Each GI carried rations that often included a Hershey's Field Ration D-bar, designed to be high in calories and resistant to melting. The soldiers didn't always like its bitter taste, but they quickly realized how much it meant to those who had nothing. When the sweeter Hershey's Tropical Bar and the colorful new M&Ms appeared in supply shipments, they became instant tokens of goodwill. The children learned to recognize the sound of American trucks before they saw them. They would gather by the roadside, waving timidly. Soldiers leaned from their jeeps, tossing handfuls of candy wrapped in foil or wax paper. The laughter that followed seemed to lift the heaviness of the occupation, if only for a moment. Not all soldiers felt comfortable with these gestures at first. The official non-fraternization policy of 1945 strictly forbade friendly contact between occupying troops and German civilians. Commanders feared that sympathy might undermine discipline or blur the line between victor and defeated. But policies could not silence human instinct. Eisenhower himself knew it would not last. Within months, the rule quietly dissolved under the weight of reality. Soldiers were already sharing food, stories, and sometimes friendships that lasted decades. The German civilian view for German civilians, the arrival of the Americans was disorienting in every possible way. They had been taught to expect monsters, men who would pillage, kill, and destroy. Instead, they found soldiers who handed out cigarettes, rations, and sweets. The shock was not merely cultural, but moral. In towns like Aachen, Kassel, and Munich, women peeked from behind curtains as GIs distributed food to local children. At first, they refused to believe it. Rumors spread quickly. The Americans have brought chocolate, some said. Others dismissed it as propaganda. But soon reality replaced rumor. The candy was real. The kindness was real. For the children, the first encounter was unforgettable. Survivors would later describe it in precise detail. The taste of chocolate melting in the mouth, the texture of the wrapper, the smell of soap and tobacco from the soldier's uniform. These sensory memories became markers of rebirth, proof that life could once again be kind. A girl from Stuttgart, Lieselotte Berger, later wrote in her diary, "I did not know what it was. He said chocolate. It was soft and sweet and made me warm inside. That was the day I stopped being afraid." That shift, from fear to warmth, was the quiet revolution that began the rebuilding of post-war Germany. Candy, as diplomacy historians, often note that the real foundation of the Marshall Plan was not dollars but decency. The moral groundwork for America's future alliance with Germany began in these early acts of personal kindness. Candy, gum, and cigarettes became informal instruments of diplomacy, small gestures that carried immense meaning in a landscape of hunger and guilt. Children followed soldiers from camp to camp, collecting wrappers as treasures. They built toy airplanes out of discarded ration tins and imitated the friendly "hello" that GIs greeted them with. German parents, at first wary, began to see the Americans not as conquerors but as protectors, especially as the Soviets advanced from the east. By late 1945, a cultural exchange had already begun. American music played from portable radios, jazz and swing filling the ruins of old halls. Soldiers invited local children to Christmas parties at their bases, decorating trees with tinsel made from foil ration wrappers. The Red Cross and the U.S. Army even sponsored school rebuilding programs, distributing crayons, notebooks, and sweets to students. The Hershey Company, meanwhile, increased production to meet military demand. It's estimated that between 1942 and 1945, the company produced over 3 billion ration bars, many of which ended up in Europe. For countless children, the word Hershey became synonymous with America itself, a symbol not of power, but of generosity, the shadow of guilt and redemption. But the sweetness of these encounters was not without complexity. Behind every smile lay the shadow of what had been lost. For the GIs who had liberated concentration camps like Buchenwald or Dachau, Handing chocolate to a child in the same country that had created such horror was a profoundly conflicting act. Many wrestled with it privately. Sergeant William Anderson, who witnessed the liberation of Dachau, wrote later, "I couldn't look at a German adult without remembering what we'd seen in the camps. But then I saw the kids and they were skin and bone, just trying to live. You realize hate can't feed anyone. For some Germans, too, the guilt was overwhelming. Parents often refused to take food directly, pushing their children forward instead. They whispered apologies the soldiers couldn't understand. The chocolate, in a strange way, became a silent confession, both a gift and an absolution. Seeds of a new generation over time, the image of American kindness became deeply embedded in post-war German culture. By the late 1940s, stories circulated of GIs who continued to send candy and care packages long after returning home. The most famous of all was Gail Halvorson, an American pilot stationed in Berlin during the Berlin airlift of 1948-49. Moved by the sight of children watching planes land from behind barbed wire, Halvorson began dropping small bundles of candy attached to handkerchief parachutes. His idea spread rapidly among other pilots, and soon thousands of candy parachutes rained down over Berlin. The children called him Uncle Wiggly Wings, but long before that famous gesture, the groundwork had already been laid. In the streets of Cologne, Hamburg, and Nuremberg, where the first pieces of chocolate passed from American hands to German ones. Those early encounters were not staged or strategic. They were spontaneous, human, and real. The result was a quiet miracle of perception. Within a few short years, the same people who had once cheered Hitler's speeches would teach their children that the Americans were friends. The candy did not erase the past, but it opened the possibility of a different future, a cultural transformation. The gesture of giving, simple, sincere, and repeated thousands of times, carried emotional weight far beyond its size. It softened the edges of occupation, transforming conquerors into examples. Soldiers became ambassadors not of authority, but of humanity. The U.S. Information Service later noted that small acts of compassion among troops did more for democratic ideals than any leaflet or broadcast. It was an acknowledgement that the moral reconstruction of Germany had begun long before the official programs of re-education. It began with a smile, a laugh, and the crinkle of a candy wrapper. In post-war Europe, America's image was not built in diplomatic halls but in ruined streets, in the hands of GIs who shared what little sweetness they had. The power of that gesture outlasted uniforms and flags. It spoke a universal truth, that even in the wake of unimaginable destruction, kindness could still find a place to exist, and in that fragile kindness traded between a soldier and a child lay the first fragile thread of a new world order. That thread would only grow, stronger as the Americans stayed, as trust deepened, and as chocolate gave way to something even more profound: friendship. The summer of 1945 brought with it a strange kind of peace, one that did not yet feel real. The guns had fallen silent, but the echo of war lingered in every street, every broken window, every breath of the people who had survived. Germany was now an occupied nation, divided into zones of control. The Americans held much of the south and west, including Bavaria, Hesse, and parts of the Rhineland. In these regions, the relationship between conqueror and conquered would soon transform in ways no one could have predicted. At first, the silence between them was cautious. The Germans watched the Americans with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The soldiers, in turn, observed a people who had been indoctrinated since childhood to see them as devils. Every interaction felt fragile, a moment that could turn in an instant. But then, slowly, gestures began to replace orders. Instead of anger, there were handshakes. Instead of punishment, there was patience. And where there had once been hatred, there was now the strange possibility of understanding. One of the most striking turning points came in the small towns and villages where American troops were stationed. Here, far from Berlin or Frankfurt, daily life between soldiers and civilians unfolded quietly and intimately. In places like Heidelberg, Würzburg, and Regensburg, American units began organizing local relief efforts. They distributed leftover army rations to families, repaired water pumps, and reopened schools that had been closed since the bombings. In one village near Darmstadt, Local witnesses later recalled a moment that symbolized this new beginning. A group of American soldiers set up a temporary field kitchen in the town square. Women and children gathered, hesitant but hungry. The soldiers handed out soup, bread, and chocolate. The children approached timidly at first, still clinging to their mother's skirts. But when the first boy reached out and accepted the sweet, the tension in the air seemed to melt. One woman wept silently, whispering that it was the first time her child had smiled since her husband died on the Eastern Front. These moments multiplied across occupied Germany. They were not planned or ordered. They were spontaneous acts of compassion, repeated thousands of times, and soon they began to ripple outward, changing the very nature of occupation itself. The Americans had come as victors, but in the eyes of many German civilians, they became something else: protectors. The difference lay not in speeches or politics, but in behavior. When GIs helped rebuild a roof, when they shared a ration, when they gave a piece of candy to a hungry child, they were showing in action what freedom could look like. It was democracy made visible not through ideology, but through empathy. The transformation reached its emotional peak in the fall of 1945, when the U.S. Army officially relaxed its non-fraternization rules. Soldiers were now allowed to speak openly with civilians, to form friendships, even to attend community events. The strict lines of separation dissolved. Markets reopened, local dances returned, and families invited soldiers into their homes for Sunday dinners. Trust was being rebuilt in real time, not between governments but between ordinary people. For many GIs, this new openness brought relief. After years of war, it gave them a sense of purpose beyond destruction. They became mentors, helpers, and symbols of stability in a nation that had forgotten what normal felt like. Some even described it as therapy, a way to cleanse their own trauma through kindness. A sergeant in the 3rd Infantry wrote home, "We thought we'd come here to occupy. Instead, we came here to teach. Every time I see a kid smile, I feel like I'm healing too." For the Germans, this period was one of awakening. They had lived under dictatorship, fear, and endless propaganda. Now they were witnessing something profoundly different. A conqueror who forgave, who rebuilt, who shared food instead of taking it. To the adults, it was a revelation. To the children, it was magic. One of those children, a girl named Anneliese Schultz, would later describe it vividly in an interview. "The first time I saw an American soldier, I thought he was a giant. He gave me a chocolate bar and said, 'Here, little one.' I didn't understand the words, but I understood the tone. My whole world changed in that second." Moments like that became the emotional core of the occupation. They erased boundaries that years of war had built. They replaced fear with curiosity, suspicion with gratitude. German children began following soldiers everywhere, outside the barracks, near trucks, by the gates of depots, waiting for the chance to catch a candy bar or gum packet. It became so common that locals jokingly referred to them as Schokoladenkinder, the chocolate children. The climax of this transformation came in 1946, during the first Christmas after the war. Across Germany, the U.S. Army organized holiday celebrations for children in occupied towns. Soldiers decorated trees with makeshift ornaments made from tinfoil and ration wrappers. They sang carols in English and German. And at the heart of every event was a simple gift: candy, chocolate, and small toys. In one of the most famous photographs of the era, taken in Frankfurt, a young American GI is seen sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by German children. They're laughing, their hands full of sweets. The soldier's helmet rests beside him, replaced by the kind of expression that only peace can bring. That image would later circulate in newspapers across both continents, a visual symbol of humanity reborn from ruin. It was at this time that the deeper meaning of these gestures became apparent. For the Americans, it wasn't only about generosity. It was about setting an example, showing that democracy wasn't just a system but a spirit. The Germans had been told that strength meant domination. Now they were learning that true strength could come from restraint, from kindness, from the simple act of giving. Even General Eisenhower, in a 1946 address to troops in Europe, acknowledged the moral weight of what was happening. "You are not only soldiers of victory, you are now soldiers of peace. The world will judge our democracy not by our words but by your conduct here." That conduct was shaping history in ways no one yet realized. While political leaders drafted treaties and reconstruction plans, it was the soldiers, the men on the ground, who were quietly winning the peace. Their interactions with civilians built a foundation of trust that would later make the Marshall Plan and even NATO possible. Chocolate, chewing gum, and smiles were not trivial. They were instruments of diplomacy wrapped in foil. They communicated what leaflets and speeches could not, that America's victory was not just military, but moral. Of course, not every encounter was perfect. There were moments of tension, misunderstandings, and bitterness that lingered. But they were the exception, not the rule. The overwhelming tone of this occupation was one of restraint and generosity. The Americans understood that they were being watched, not just by the Germans, but by the world. The future of Europe depended on what kind of peace they created. And so, from the ashes of a war that had consumed millions, something rare emerged: reconciliation through compassion. It didn't come from politicians or generals, but from ordinary men carrying Hershey bars in their pockets. By 1947, as Europe began to rebuild, this transformation was complete. In the same towns that had once cheered for Hitler, children now ran to greet American soldiers by name. Families traded food, stories, and laughter. Markets filled again. Schools reopened. Hope returned. In the history books, this period would be summarized as the American occupation of Germany. But for those who lived it, it was something far deeper, a slow and fragile rediscovery of humanity itself. In the end, the great turning point of post-war Europe wasn't written in treaties or speeches. It was written in gestures, in the hands that gave instead of taking, in the smiles that replaced fear, and in the crinkle of a chocolate wrapper that meant, perhaps for the first time, the war was truly over. And from those simple gestures came the first flicker of a new alliance, one built not on power, but on respect. The same children who once reached out for candy would grow up to become the first generation of a free, democratic Germany, among a nation reborn not by conquest, but by compassion. The ruins were still there, but so was something stronger, the proof that even in the aftermath of the darkest war in history, the human heart could choose light. By 1947, the rhythm of post-war Germany had changed. What began as surrender had transformed into survival, and then, slowly, into renewal. The ruins still dominated the skylines of cities like Cologne, Munich, and Frankfurt, but among the broken bricks, the sounds of life had returned. Children's laughter drifted through alleys once choked by smoke. Bakeries reopened, music crackled faintly from American radios, and the word Freiheit, freedom, was no longer whispered, but spoken aloud. The American presence remained vast. Nearly 1.6 million U.S. soldiers still occupied the western zones, serving as both enforcers and examples. Yet over time their rifles lowered, and their hands opened. The once uneasy coexistence between conqueror and conquered had turned into something entirely new: coexistence through compassion. It began with food, of course. Ration systems gradually stabilized under Allied administration. Families who had once survived on watery soups now received packages of flour, powdered milk, and sugar. But beyond the material relief, it was the emotional repair that mattered most. To the German people, exhausted, humiliated, and lost, the American soldier came to represent not vengeance but possibility. Letters and diaries from this period describe the strange duality of occupation. In one, a German mother from Kassel wrote, "We feared they would destroy what was left, but the Americans brought calm. They brought food. They smiled at our children. It is strange. They have forgiven us faster than we have forgiven ourselves." In that line lay the essence of what had begun, the rebuilding not only of a nation, but of conscience. The simple acts of generosity, the shared chocolate bars, the chewing gum, the laughter, became symbols of America's new role. Soldiers who once fought in the forests of the Ardennes now found themselves fixing school roofs, planting vegetable gardens, or organizing Christmas plays for local children. In their pockets, the same Hershey bars that had sweetened battle rations now sweetened peace. The American military government, known as OMGUS, Office of Military Government, United States, soon recognized the power of these small gestures. Reports described how local attitudes toward Americans were changing rapidly. Hostility had turned to curiosity, curiosity to trust. Commanders encouraged their men to maintain this image of fairness, order, and humanity. "Your behavior," one memo read, "is the democracy they will remember." That democracy was now taking root in unexpected ways. Schools reopened under Allied supervision, purged of Nazi propaganda. Libraries filled once again with banned books, Thomas Mann, Goethe, and even American writers like Steinbeck and Hemingway. In classrooms, children drew the American flag alongside their own, often with candy wrappers pressed flat and glued to their pages for decoration. And in the middle of all this, candy itself had become a kind of national legend. The Hershey bar, once a simple ration item, had taken on mythic status. To a generation that had known only scarcity, it represented abundance. To a society that had been taught to hate, it represented kindness. German newspapers even ran stories about the Schokoladsoldaten, the chocolate soldiers, who gave without expecting anything in return. By the late 1940s, as the Cold War dawned, this image became more than sentimental. It was strategic. The generosity of ordinary soldiers had laid the foundation for one of the most remarkable diplomatic shifts in modern history. Within just 5 years, Germany had gone from being America's sworn enemy to its crucial ally in the emerging East-West divide. That transformation began not in Washington or Bonn, but on the streets, in the spaces where kindness had already built bridges long before politics caught up. Nowhere was this more visible than in the events leading up to the Berlin airlift, 1948-49, one of the most dramatic humanitarian operations of the century. When the Soviet Union blockaded West Berlin, cutting off food and fuel supplies, the American response was immediate. Fleets of aircraft began flying in essentials day and night, but amid the tons of coal and grain, there were also smaller, lighter packages, parachutes made from handkerchiefs carrying candy bars and gum. The pilot behind this idea was Lieutenant Gail Halvorson, who became known worldwide as the Candy Bomber. Inspired by the sight of Berlin children watching from behind barbed wire fences, he began dropping sweets from his plane before landing. Word spread, and soon hundreds of pilots joined in. By the time the airlift ended, over 23 tons of candy had been dropped on the city. Halvorson's simple act of generosity captured everything the earlier years of occupation had stood for. It wasn't just about feeding the hungry. It was about showing that compassion could cross walls, borders, and ideologies. The children of Germany, once the face of defeat, had become symbols of renewal. Meanwhile, back in the smaller towns, daily life continued to change. GIs who had once been strangers were now part of local families. Some fell in love with German women, leading to tens of thousands of marriages, a quiet but profound merging of former enemies into one future. Churches that had been silent during the war now held weddings between American soldiers and German brides, attended by both communities. In cultural terms, this blending created something entirely new. American jazz and swing spread through the ruins. Portable radios crackled with the voices of Louis Armstrong and Glenn Miller. Young Germans began to imitate the mannerisms and language of their liberators. English phrases slipped into daily speech. Okay, thanks, bye. To the older generation, it was disorienting. To the young, it was intoxicating. Chocolate, meanwhile, remained an emblem, a reminder that joy could exist even after horror. Children traded the wrappers as collectibles, using them as pretend currency in their games. In some schools, teachers used them as prizes for attendance. A whole subculture of sweetness emerged from the shadow of starvation. But beyond the candy and laughter, there was something deeper happening, a moral awakening. The Germans began to confront the truth of what had happened under the Nazi regime. American authorities encouraged this reckoning carefully but firmly. Newsreels of concentration camps were shown in public halls. Trials at Nuremberg revealed atrocities in painful detail. The candy and chocolate that children held became, in a strange way, a counterweight to those images, a symbol of what humanity could be, even after descending into inhumanity. The American soldiers had not just brought supplies, they had brought an example of conduct. Their restraint, their generosity, and their sense of justice became a living lesson. For a people who had been taught to equate authority with fear, it was a revelation to see power exercised through decency. By 1949, the political reconstruction of West Germany was underway. The U.S. continued to supply aid through the Marshall Plan, rebuilding cities, industries, and infrastructure, but it was the moral groundwork laid by those early acts of kindness that made the program work. Economic assistance was built upon emotional trust. Trust that had begun with a chocolate bar handed to a starving child. Even decades later, this memory persisted. When West Germany rose to become an economic powerhouse in the 1950s, many older citizens credited not just American money, but American mercy. They gave us food, one recalled. But more than that, they gave us dignity. The children who had once stood barefoot in the rubble became the generation that rebuilt the nation. Many of them would go on to teach their own children about the American soldiers who came not to punish, but to help. Some even sent letters to their former liberators, now older men in quiet American towns, thanking them for small acts that had changed their lives. In 1994, nearly 50 years after the war, the German government invited Gail Halvorsen to Berlin to commemorate the anniversary of the airlift. Thousands of people gathered, many of them elderly now, carrying photographs of themselves as children beneath his candy parachutes. Halvorsen stood on the tarmac, tears in his eyes as he said, "It wasn't the chocolate that mattered. It was the thought that someone still cared." That thought had been born years earlier, in 1945, in the ruins of Germany, when GIs knelt on broken streets and offered pieces of chocolate to children who had nothing left. That single gesture had rewritten the story of a nation, transforming enemies into allies, despair into gratitude, ruin into rebirth. By the end of the decade, the once unthinkable was true. Americans and Germans no longer faced each other across battlefields but stood side by side against new challenges. The taste of chocolate had faded, but its meaning endured, a reminder that even after humanity's darkest hour, kindness could still prevail. The war had begun with hatred and ended with hunger, but its legacy, the one that would outlast all others, was sweetness. And from that sweetness, a new world order emerged, built not only on treaties and trade, but on the memory of a simple truth: that peace can begin with the smallest act of compassion. The wrappers may have crinkled and disappeared long ago, but their sound still echoes through history, the whisper of paper and foil in a silent street, and the laughter of children who, for the first time in years, believed the world could be kind again. The story of American soldiers handing out chocolate in the ruins of Germany is, at its heart, the story of how humanity reclaimed itself. After 6 years of total war, after cities turned to ash and millions vanished in camps and fields, the world had every reason to remain divided by bitterness. Yet in the hands of ordinary young men, something unexpected happened. Compassion reappeared where hatred had once lived. The GIs didn't carry philosophy books or political manifestos. They carried Hershey bars, chewing gum, and ration tins, small pieces of America in a land of loss. But those small pieces meant everything. They showed a defeated people that mercy existed, that the victors had come not only to occupy but to rebuild, to forgive, and to remind others, and themselves, what it meant to be human again. The chocolate shared on ruined streets became more than sweetness. It became memory. For the children who tasted it, it was the flavor of peace. For the soldiers who offered it, it was the quiet healing of conscience. Together, these moments formed an unspoken bridge, a thread of understanding between two worlds that had tried to destroy each other. History often records war in terms of battles, dates, and treaties. But sometimes the true turning points come from gestures too small to fit into official reports. The hand that gives instead of takes, the smile that answers fear, the soft crinkle of a candy wrapper in a city learning to hope again. By the time the post-war years gave way to a new Germany, that spirit had taken root. The same children who once gathered at American trucks would grow into the generation that rebuilt Europe, that embraced democracy, and that never forgot the kindness of strangers in uniform. In the end, The story of the chocolate and the GIs is not just about sweetness. It is about redemption, about the power of simple decency to outlast destruction. It reminds us that even in the darkest corners of history, light can return, sometimes carried not by politicians or generals, but by young soldiers with pockets full of candy and hearts full of grace.